My name is Amelie, and I never imagined that my sister's wedding in Hawaii would mark the beginning of a nightmare in my own home. It was supposed to be a week of pure joy, sunshine, and family celebrations. Claire's wedding had been planned for months, and we were all looking forward to gathering on this island paradise for the occasion. The flight to Honolulu was long, but the excitement of reuniting with my family and taking part in this important event made me forget how tired I was. As soon as we arrived, my husband Francois and I were overwhelmed by the beauty of the island. The white sandy beaches, the turquoise ocean, the lush vegetation, everything seemed like something out of a postcard. The days leading up to the wedding were filled with last-minute preparations and moments of family togetherness. I helped Claire finalize the details of her dress, we laughed together at her bachelorette party, and I even had time to relax on the beach with Francois. It was perfect, maybe too perfect. The big day arrived, and the ceremony was magical. Claire looked radiant in her wedding dress, and seeing the tears of joy in our parents' eyes moved me deeply. We danced, ate, and celebrated into the wee hours. I'll always remember those moments. However, in the midst of all this joy, I noticed that Francois seemed preoccupied. He received a lot of messages and often slipped away to make calls. When I asked him if everything was okay, he assured me it was just work and encouraged me to enjoy the party. I should have insisted, I should have sensed that something was wrong, but the euphoria of the moment blinded me. The return to reality was brutal. After a week of dreaming, we flew home to Paris. On the flight, I talked excitedly about our plans for the coming summer, while Francois seemed increasingly nervous as we neared home. "Darling," he said as we collected our luggage at Charles de Gaulle Airport, "there's something I need to tell you." My heart clenched. I knew that tone. It was the one he used when he'd done something stupid. "What?" I asked, already dreading the answer. "My mother, she had some problems and she came to stay with us while we were away." I thought I misheard. "What do you mean, move in with us? For how long?" Francois looked away. "I don't know exactly. She needed a place to go and..." I didn't hear the rest. My mind was spinning, trying to figure out how we'd gone from an idyllic week to this. Martine, my mother-in-law, and I had always had a complicated relationship. She was intrusive, critical, and never missed an opportunity to remind me that I wasn't good enough for her son. The cab ride to our apartment was marked by a heavy silence. I tried to calm myself down, to convince myself that it was only temporary, that we'd find a solution soon. But deep down, I knew nothing would be easy. When we arrived in front of our apartment building, I took a deep breath before climbing the stairs. Francois, carrying our suitcases, followed close behind. Arriving at our door, I hesitated for a moment before inserting the key into the lock. The smell hit me as soon as I opened the door. That heady perfume Martine always wore, a mix of jasmine and vanilla that made me nauseous. Suitcases were piled up in the hallway, as if someone had moved their entire wardrobe to our house. "Martine," I called, trying to keep my voice calm despite the anger rising inside me. "Ah, there you are at last." My mother-in-law's voice came from the living room. I headed for the room, Francois hot on my heels. And there I saw her. Martine was comfortably ensconced on our sofa, leafing through a magazine as if she were at home. She looked up at us, a condescending smile on her lips. "Hello, Amelie. I hope you had a good trip." I looked around, dumbfounded. In the space of a week, our living room had been completely rearranged. My books had been moved, replaced by knickknacks I didn't recognize. Photos of Martine and Francois now adorned the shelves, relegating our own memories to the background. "Martine," I began, trying to keep my composure, "what are you doing here? Francois told me you were in trouble, but..." She cut me off with a wave of her hand. "Oh, it's nothing serious. I just needed a change of scenery. Besides, Francois always said I could come whenever I wanted, didn't he, my darling?" I glanced at my husband, who suddenly seemed very interested in his shoes. "Francois?" I insisted. "Well," he stammered, "I did say that, but I didn't think..." "Never mind," Martine interrupted him. "What's done is done. I'm sure Amelie understands the importance of family, don't you?" I clenched my fists, feeling the anger rising inside me. Martine, I'm sorry, but you can't just move in here without talking to us. We need to. Oh, dear, she cut me off with a honeyed smile. If you don't want to share this house, you can always leave. The shock left me speechless. I looked at Francois, waiting for him to say something, to come to my defense. But he remained silent, clearly uncomfortable but unable to stand up to his mother. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just an impromptu visit. Martine intended to stay, and was ready to push me out if necessary. Initial shock quickly gave way to seething rage. How dare she? How could Francois let this happen? I left the living room without a word, unable to bear Martine's presence another second. As I passed the hall mirror, I saw my reflection. The face I saw there was no longer that of the happy, relaxed woman who'd left for Hawaii a week earlier. It was the face of a betrayed, angry and determined woman. One thing was certain, I wasn't going to let her get away with it. If Martine thought she could simply force her way into my life and take control of my home, she was sadly mistaken. The battle was just beginning, and I was ready to fight tooth and nail for my home and my marriage. That week in Hawaii now seemed so long ago, like a dream from which one is rudely awakened. Paradise had given way to hell, and I was going to have to find a way out. The days following my return from Hawaii were a nightmare. Every morning, I woke up hoping that it was all just a bad dream, but reality caught up with me as soon as I heard Martine busy in the kitchen. The first Monday after our return, I got up early to go to work. I was hoping for a quiet coffee before facing the day, but Martine was already there, rearranging my cupboards. "Good morning, Amelie," she said without even turning around. "I thought it was time to put some order here. How can you live in such chaos?" I gritted my teeth, inwardly counting to 10 to keep from exploding. "Martine, please don't touch my things." She turned to me, a condescending smile on her lips. "My dear, I'm only helping you. A woman your age should know how to run a house properly." I opened my mouth to retort, but Francois walked in just then. "Is everything okay here?" he asked, clearly uncomfortable. "Perfectly fine," Martine replied before I could say anything. "I was just showing Amelie how to organize a kitchen efficiently." Francois nodded, avoiding my gaze. That's nice, Mom." I grabbed my bag and walked out without a word, furious with Martine, but even more furious with Francois, who said nothing. The following days followed the same pattern. Martine constantly criticized my habits, the way I cooked, the way I cleaned, even the way I dressed. Whenever I tried to defend myself, she would turn the situation to her advantage, making me look like the ingrate who didn't appreciate her advice. One evening, I came home from work to find Martine rummaging through our bedroom. "What are you doing?" I asked, shocked. "Oh, I was just looking for some space to put my things away," she replied nonchalantly. "You have so many clothes you never wear, Amelie. I thought I'd sort through it and donate what you don't need to charity." This was too much. "Get out of my room immediately," I yelled. "You have no right to touch my things." Martine looked offended. "I was only helping you." "Really, Amelie, your ingratitude is hurtful." Francois arrived, alerted by my cries. "What's going on here?" "Your mother was going through our things," I explained, trembling with anger. Francois looked at his mother, then at me, visibly uncomfortable. "I'm sure she didn't mean any harm." I stared at my husband, incredulous. "You're taking her side. She's invading our privacy and you think that's normal?" "Amelie, calm down," he said softly. "Mommy was just trying to help." It was then that I realized how serious the situation was. Not only had Martine taken control of our house, but she was coming between Francois and me. Over the next few days, I began to avoid the common areas of the house. I'd leave early in the morning and return late at night, spending as much time as possible at the office or with friends. Our apartment, once my haven of peace, had become a battlefield that I dreaded. One Saturday morning, as I ate my breakfast in silence, Martine entered the kitchen, followed by two women I didn't know. "Amelie, I'd like you to meet Giselle and Monique, my friends from the bridge club," she announced cheerfully. "I thought it would be nice to organize a little afternoon tea." I nearly choked on my coffee. "Excuse me? You invite people into our home without asking our permission?" Giselle and Monique exchanged embarrassed glances, but Martine brushed off my remark with a wave of her hand. Don't be so dramatic, Amélie. It's just tea with friends. I looked at Francois, who was reading his newspaper and pretending not to hear. Aren't you going to say anything? I asked him. He looked up, looking embarrassed. Well, it's only tea. That was the last straw. I stormed out of the room, slamming our bedroom door behind me. I spent the afternoon locked in, listening to the laughter and chatter coming from the living room, feeling like a stranger in my own home. That evening, once the guests had left, I confronted Francois. This can't go on, I said firmly. Your mother has completely taken over our lives. Francois sighed. I know it's hard, Amélie, but what do you want me to do? She's my mother. And I'm your wife. I shouted, exasperated. Can't you see she's destroying our marriage? We had a long and painful discussion that night. Francois oscillated between understanding my frustration and defending his mother. He promised to try and talk to Martine, to make her understand that she had to respect our limits. But the following days proved that this conversation had been to no avail. Martine continued her criticisms, her rearrangements, her impromptu invitations. She acted as if she were at home, completely ignoring my protests. One evening, as I was coming home from work, I found Martine replacing the photos of our wedding with photos of her and Francois when he was a child. What are you doing? I asked, feeling anger welling up inside me. Oh, I just thought these pictures were more appropriate in the living room, she replied with a cheesy smile. After all, they represent family history. Our marriage is also part of the family history, I retorted, trying hard to keep my cool. Martine laughed condescendingly. My dear, a wedding is just an event. The bond between a mother and son is forever. That's when it hit me. Martine wasn't just imposing herself on us, she was actively trying to erase me from Francois' life. Every gesture, every remark was calculated to make me feel out of place. That night, lying in our bed, I watched Francois sleeping peacefully beside me. How could he not see what was happening? How could he remain passive in the face of this situation? I realized that if I wanted to save my marriage and get my life back, I had to act. Martine wouldn't leave on her own, and Francois seemed incapable of taking a stand. It was time to take matters into my own hands. The next morning, I made a decision. I was going to document Martine's every action, every inappropriate remark, every intrusion into our private life. If Francois couldn't see the problem, I was going to show it to him in black and white. I started keeping a detailed log of every incident. I even considered installing security cameras in the common areas of the apartment, but quickly abandoned the idea, not wanting to stoop to Martine's level of invasion of privacy. As the days went by, the tension kept mounting. Martine seemed to take great pleasure in pushing me to my limits, constantly testing my boundaries. Francois, meanwhile, was spending more and more time at the office, clearly avoiding the conflict that was brewing at home. One evening, as I was coming home late from work, hoping to avoid another confrontation, I found Martine sitting in the dark in our living room. Ah, Amélie, she said in a sweet voice that made me shiver. I was beginning to wonder if you were coming home tonight. What do you want, Martine? I asked, too tired to play her games. She stood up slowly, approaching me. I want you to understand something, my dear. Francois is my son. He always has been and always will be. You're just a passing fancy. Sooner or later, he'll realize he deserves better. Her words hit me like a slap in the face. For the first time, Martine was making her intentions clear. It was no longer a question of living together or petty domestic quarrels. It was open warfare for Francois's love and attention. I clenched my fists, fighting the urge to scream or worse. Instead, I took a deep breath and said in a calm but firm voice, "You're wrong, Martine. Francois chose me. We've built a life together. And I have no intention of letting anyone, not even you, destroy that." With that, I locked myself in our bedroom, my heart pounding. The confrontation had clarified things. It was no longer a question of difficult cohabitation or minor inconveniences. Martine had declared war on our marriage, and I was determined to win. That night, lying in bed unable to sleep, I realized I had to take action. The journals I'd been keeping, the evidence I'd been accumulating, it all had to add up to something. It was time to take drastic measures to save my marriage and my sanity. The next morning, I made an appointment with a family lawyer. I still didn't know exactly what I was going to do, but one thing was certain: I wasn't going to let myself be chased out of my own home without a fight. The meeting with Maître Dupont, the family lawyer, was the turning point in this nightmarish situation. Sitting in his office, I unpacked the whole story, my voice trembling at times with emotion and frustration. So, if I understand correctly, Maître Dupont summarized after listening attentively, your mother-in-law has moved into your home without your consent and refuses to leave, all the while disrupting your daily life and your marriage. I nodded, relieved that someone finally understood the gravity of the situation. And your husband, he continued, remains passive in the face of this situation? He's stuck, I admitted reluctantly. I know he loves me, but he has a hard time standing up to his mother. Maître Dupont took a few notes before looking me straight in the eye. Madame Martin, I'm not going to lie to you. The situation is delicate, especially from a legal point of view. Your mother-in-law is not officially a tenant, but she lives in your home with the consent of your husband, who is a co-owner. This complicates things. My heart clenched. So, I have no recourse. I didn't say that, he replied with a slight smile. We have options, but we must act intelligently. Here's what I propose. Over the next hour, Maître Dupont outlined a plan of action. He advised me to continue documenting each incident, but in a more structured way. He provided me with legal forms to record the facts accurately and with a date. These documents could prove crucial if we were to go to court, he explained. But I hope it doesn't come to that. He also suggested that I install security cameras in the common areas of the apartment, after informing my husband and mother-in-law in writing. This will serve as both evidence and deterrent, he added. Finally, he advised me to try one last time to dialogue with François, this time with the help of a family mediator. I left his office with a mixture of apprehension and hope. I finally had a plan, a direction to follow. Over the next few days, I set up the documentation system suggested by Maître Dupont. Every inappropriate remark Martine made, every intrusion into our private life, was carefully recorded. I also informed François and Martine of my intention to install security cameras, which provoked a sharp reaction from my mother-in-law. This is ridiculous, she exclaimed. Don't you trust me? I'm family, not an intruder. It's for everyone's safety, I replied calmly, striving to keep my composure. Besides, if you've got nothing to hide, you shouldn't object, should you? François, as usual, stood back, visibly uncomfortable. But for once, he didn't come to his mother's defense, which I considered a small victory. Parallel to these actions, I began to research Martine's past. Something in her behavior suggested to me that she was hiding something. Why had she moved in with us so suddenly? What had happened in her life to make her need a refuge? I spent hours on the internet, digging through online archives, contacting Martine's former neighbors and colleagues. At first, I couldn't find anything conclusive. Martine seemed to have led an ordinary life, working as an accountant for years before retiring. But one evening, while browsing local forums, I came across a message that caught my eye. A woman named Elise was talking about how her elderly mother had been swindled by a charming lady who introduced herself as a retired financial advisor. The description of this lady was an uncanny match for Martine. Intrigued, I contacted Elise. After a few exchanges, she sent me a photo of the woman in question. My heart leapt into my chest. It was Martine, a few years younger, but definitely her. This discovery was the starting point for further investigation. I contacted other people mentioned in the forum, and little by little, a disturbing picture began to emerge. Martine, under various pseudonyms, had apparently conned several elderly people into believing in lucrative investments that didn't exist. The shock of this revelation left me speechless. How could this be possible? How could François' mother, a woman who prided herself on being beyond reproach, be involved in such activities? I hesitated for a long time before telling François. I knew this information would upset him, perhaps even shatter the trust he had in his mother. But I couldn't keep it to myself. One evening, while Martine was out with her friends, I decided to reveal everything to Francois. "Darling, I need to talk to you about something important," I began, my heart pounding. Francois looked up from his computer, looking worried. "What's going on, Amélie?" I took a deep breath. "It's about your mother. I've discovered something serious." For the next hour, I told Francois everything I'd discovered. The testimonies, the evidence, the photos. As I spoke, I could see his face decompose. This isn't possible," he whispered, incredulous. "My mother would never do that." "I know it's hard to believe, Francois," I said softly, resting my hand on hers. "But the evidence is there. Your mother conned old people. That's probably why she moved in with us so suddenly. She was running away from something." Francois remained silent for a long moment, staring at the documents I had spread out on the table. I could almost see the cogs turning in his head, all the pieces of the puzzle finally coming together. I need some air," he finally said, standing up abruptly. He walked out of the apartment, leaving me alone with my thoughts and worries. Had I done the right thing revealing all this to him? Shouldn't I have waited until I had more solid proof? Francois came home late that night. His eyes were red, as if he'd been crying. Without a word, he sat down next to me on the sofa. "I called my aunt," he said after a long silence. She confirmed to me that Mom was having money problems. She didn't know exactly what was going on, but she knew it was serious. I took his hand in mine, not knowing what to say. "I'm sorry, Amélie," he continued, his voice breaking slightly. "I should have listened to you sooner. I should have seen that something was wrong." That night, Francois and I talked at length. For the first time in weeks, we were really on the same wavelength. We discussed what we were going to do, how to confront Martine, what this meant for our family. The next morning, as we ate our breakfast in silence, Martine entered the kitchen, cheerful as usual. "Bonjour, Ms. Cherise," she crooned. "What do you have planned for today?" Francois looked up at his mother, and I saw a determination I'd never seen before in his eyes. "Mom," he said in a firm voice, "we need to talk." Martine froze, her smile wavering slightly. "Of course, my darling. What do you want to talk about?" "About the real reason you came to live with us," Francois replied. "About what really happened before you came here." Martine's face went white as a sheet. Her gaze went from Francois to me, then back to Francois. I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, but her usual assurance was gone. "Don't lie, Mom," Francois said, his voice trembling slightly. "We know all about it. The scams, the old people you conned. Why? How could you do this?" Martine collapsed into a chair, all trace of her confident facade gone. For the first time since I'd known her, she seemed vulnerable, almost fragile. I didn't mean to," she whispered. "At first, it was just to make ends meet. Then the debts piled up, and I didn't know how to get out." Tears streamed down her cheeks as she told us how she had let herself be drawn into this spiral of swindles, how the fear of being discovered had driven her to come and take refuge with us. Francois listened, his face serious. I could see the pain in his eyes, the disappointment, but also a glimmer of compassion. "Mom," he said softly when she'd finished speaking, "you can't go on like this. You have to accept the consequences of your actions." Martine nodded, defeated. "I know," she whispered. "I'm so sorry. For everything." That morning marked a turning point in our lives. Martine agreed to go to the police and confess everything. Francois, despite his pain, promised to support her through this ordeal. As for me, I found myself in a position I'd never imagined, that of support for my husband and, in a way, for my mother-in-law. It was going to be a long and difficult road, but for the first time in weeks, I felt we were moving in the right direction. This revelation, painful as it was, had had an unexpected effect. It had brought Francois and me closer together, reminding us of the importance of communication and trust in our relationship. And somehow, despite everything that had happened, I was grateful for that. The days following the revelation of Martine's activities were a whirlwind of emotion and action. Francois and I decided to face the situation head-on, armed with the evidence I'd gathered and the support of Maître Dupont. One morning, as Martine was having breakfast in the kitchen, Francois and I entered, looking determined. I had a thick file under my arm, containing all the evidence I'd gathered. "Mom," Francois began in a firm voice, "we need to talk." "Seriously?" Martine looked up from her coffee, her face shifting from surprise to concern as she saw our serious expressions. "What's going on?" she asked, trying to keep her tone light. I put the file on the table and opened it. "Martine, we know everything," I said calmly. "The scams, the elderly people you've conned, the reasons for your sudden arrival with us." Martine's face went white as a sheet. She looked at Francois, perhaps seeking a sign of support or denial, but found only disappointment and determination in his eyes. I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, but her voice trembled. Francois shook his head. "Please, Mama. Please don't lie. Don't lie now. We have the evidence." I started pulling documents out of the file, testimonials, bank statements, photos. Each piece was damning evidence of Martine's fraudulent activities. As I laid out the evidence, I could see Martine crumbling in her chair. Her mask of confidence and superiority cracked, revealing a frightened and desperate woman. I didn't mean for it to go this far," she finally whispered, tears in her eyes. "At first, it was just to make ends meet. Then the debts piled up, and I didn't know how to get out of it." Francois pulled up a chair and sat down opposite his mother. I did the same, keeping a respectful but firm distance. "Mom," Francois said in a soft but firm voice, "we understand that you may have found yourself in a difficult situation. But what you've done is serious. You've hurt people, you've betrayed their trust." Martine burst into tears. "I'm so sorry," she repeated between hiccups. "I didn't know what to do. I was ashamed, I was afraid." I took a deep breath before speaking. "Martine, we're not here to judge you. But we can't go on like this. You must assume the consequences of your actions." Francois nodded, supporting my words. "Mom, we want to help you. But to do that, you have to be honest with us and with yourself." For the next few hours, Martine told us everything. How she had started by borrowing money from acquaintances, promising huge returns on investment. How, unable to repay, she turned to the most vulnerable, mainly isolated elderly people. How guilt and fear had eaten her up inside, finally driving her to seek refuge with us. At the end of her story, Martine seemed drained, but also relieved to have finally been able to confess everything. "What happens now?" she asked in a small voice. Francois and I exchanged a look. We'd discussed it at length the day before, weighing the pros and cons of each option. "Mom," Francois said softly, "we think the best thing to do is to turn you into the police." Martine gasped, fear evident in her eyes. The police?" I spoke up. "Martine, what you've done is a crime. If you voluntarily turn yourself in and cooperate, it will work in your favor. Besides, it's the only way to start righting the wrongs you've caused." "But, will I go to jail?" she asked, her voice trembling. "It's a possibility," Francois admitted. "But we'll be there to support you. And that's the only way out of this vicious circle, Mom. You can't keep running away." After lengthy discussions and many tears, Martine finally agreed to surrender. We contacted Maître Dupont, who arranged a meeting with the prosecutor the following day. The night was long and tense. Martine remained locked in her room, while Francois and I chatted in hushed tones in the living room, preparing ourselves for what was to come. The next morning, we went to the courthouse. Maître Dupont was waiting for us at the entrance, his face serious but reassuring. "You've made the right decision," he told us. "Madame Martin's cooperation will be crucial for the future." While Maître Dupont conferred with the prosecutor, we waited in a cold, impersonal corridor. Martine, sitting between Francois and me, seemed to have aged 10 years overnight. Finally, we were ushered into an office. The prosecutor, a woman in her 50s with piercing eyes, listened attentively as Martine made her confession, supported by the evidence we had brought. At the end of the interview, the prosecutor spoke. "Ms. Martin, I won't hide from you that the charges against you are serious. However, your cooperation and voluntary surrender will be taken into account. For the time being, You will be remanded in custody while we investigate this matter further." Martine nodded, resigned. As we led her away, she turned to us. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "For everything." Francois hugged her one last time before she disappeared behind a door, escorted by 2 agents. The journey home was silent. Francois was lost in thought, and I respected his need for silence. It wasn't until we walked through the door of our apartment that he finally spoke. "I can't believe this is all real," he said, collapsing on the couch. I sat down next to him, taking his hand in mine. "I know. It's a lot to take in." Francois looked at me, his eyes bright with restrained tears. "Amélie, I'm so sorry. For everything my mother put you through, for not listening to you sooner." I squeezed his hand. "You don't have to apologize for your mother's actions, Francois." And we got through it together. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of emotion and action. There were hearings, meetings with lawyers, endless discussions about what we were going to do next. At the same time, Francois and I had to deal with the consequences of the affair on our personal lives. Friends and family, shocked by the revelations, asked us questions we weren't always ready to answer. One evening, as we sat in our living room, exhausted after another long day, Francois looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. "Amélie," he said softly, "I don't know how I would have gotten through all this without you. You've been incredibly strong and brave." I felt tears welling up in my eyes. "We're a team, Francois. In good times and bad." He took me in his arms, and we stayed that way for a long time, finding comfort in each other's presence. The months that followed were difficult, but also revealing. Martine's trial finally took place, and she was sentenced to prison with an obligation to repay her victims. Francois and I decided to use this experience to strengthen our relationship. We began couples therapy, learning to communicate more openly and to face life's challenges together. Little by little, we rebuilt our lives. Our apartment, which had been the scene of so much tension, became our haven of peace once again. We even started talking about starting a family, feeling that the ordeal had made us stronger and more united than ever. A year after the whole thing began, as we ate breakfast one Sunday morning, Francois looked at me with a smile. "You know," he said, "despite everything that's happened, I'm grateful." I raised an eyebrow, surprised. "Grateful?" He nodded. "Yes. This ordeal has shown us how strong we are together. It taught us the importance of trust and honesty. And she made me realize how lucky I am to have you as my partner in life." I felt my heart swell with love and gratitude. "I feel the same way," I replied softly. We toasted with our cups of coffee, celebrating not the end of an ordeal, but the beginning of a new chapter in our lives, stronger and more united than ever. The months following Martine's conviction were a period of deep introspection and reconstruction for Francois and me. We had weathered a storm that could easily have destroyed our marriage, but instead it had brought us closer together in ways we'd never imagined. Our first step in this healing process was to enroll in couples therapy. At first, Francois was reluctant. "We're fine now," he had argued. "Why bring up the past?" But I insisted, feeling that we needed professional help to really get over what we'd been through. Our first session with Dr. Moreau was difficult. Sitting side by side on a comfortable couch in his warm office, we suddenly felt uncomfortable, not knowing where to begin. "Tell me about what brings you here," Dr. Moreau gently encouraged. Francois and I looked at each other, hesitant. Finally, I took a deep breath and began to tell our story. As I spoke, I could feel Francois tense up beside me. When I finished, he spoke up, his voice trembling with emotion. "I feel so guilty," he admitted. "I should have seen what was happening. I should have protected Amélie." Dr. Moreau nodded understandingly. "Guilt is a natural emotion in a situation like this. But remember, you were also a victim in this story." Over the weeks, our sessions became a safe space where we could express our fears, frustrations, and hopes. We learned to communicate more effectively, to really listen to each other without judgment. One day, as we were discussing Martine's impact on our relationship, Dr. Moreau asked us a thought-provoking question: "What positive lessons can you draw from this experience?" Francois and I remained silent for a while, thinking. Finally, I spoke up. I've learned the importance of trusting my instincts, I said. At first I doubted myself, I thought I was exaggerating. But now I know I have to listen to my inner voice. Francois nodded. For me, I've learned the importance of setting boundaries, even with family. I always thought love meant accepting everything from each other, but now I understand that it's healthy and necessary to have boundaries. These realizations marked a turning point in our therapy and in our relationship. We began to see our experience not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity for growth. Alongside our therapy, we decided to make changes in our daily lives. Our apartment, which had been the scene of so much drama, needed to be transformed. One Saturday morning, we got up early, determined to breathe new life into our living space. Armed with brushes and pots of paint, we attacked the walls of our living room. What color are you thinking of for this wall? I asked Francois, hesitating between a sky blue and a soft green. He thought for a moment before answering with a mischievous smile. Why not both? We could do a gradient. I laughed, surprised by his audacity. You, who were always so conservative when it came to decorating, he shrugged. New life, new rules. Besides, I've learned that you have to take risks every now and then. We spent the weekend painting, moving furniture around, hanging new frames. Each brushstroke seemed to erase a little more of the bad memories, replacing them with hope and joy. On Sunday evening, exhausted but satisfied, we sat on our new sofa, admiring our work. It's like breathing easier in here now, Francois commented, putting his arm around my shoulders. I nodded, snuggling against him. This is our new beginning. This transformation of our physical space had a profound impact on our state of mind. We felt lighter, more optimistic about the future. But rebuilding our lives wasn't limited to our home. We also had to face the outside world, friends and family who had witnessed our ordeal. Certain relationships were put to the test. Friends who had sided with Martine at the start of the affair have distanced themselves, embarrassed by the turn of events. Others, however, surprised us with their unfailing support. My sister Claire, whose wedding in Hawaii marked the beginning of this whole story, was a pillar of strength for us. One evening, when she had come to dinner, she looked at us with shining eyes. You know, she said, I'm so proud of you both. You went through hell and came out stronger. His words touched us deeply. It was true, we had survived a storm that could have destroyed us. Over time, we learned to talk openly about our experience, not as a source of shame, but as a testament to our resilience. This brought us closer to certain friends and family members who had perhaps been afraid to broach the subject. One day, Francois came home from work with a pensive expression on his face. What's wrong? I asked, worried. He shook his head. It's nothing serious. It's just. I got a letter from Mom today. My heart sank. We hadn't heard from Martine since her incarceration, except through her lawyer. What's she saying? I asked softly. Francois pulled a crumpled envelope from his pocket. She apologizes. She says she's undergoing therapy in prison and is beginning to understand the magnitude of her actions. She asks if we'd be willing to visit her sometime. I took a deep breath. This was a crucial moment, I knew. Our reaction to this request could define the rest of our story. What do you think? I asked Francois, careful to keep my tone neutral. He ran a hand through his hair, a sign of his confusion. I don't know. Part of me wants to see it, to try and understand. But another part is afraid of falling back into old patterns. We talked at length that evening, weighing up the pros and cons. Finally, we decided to talk to Dr. Moreau about it at our next session. It's a very personal decision, Dr. Moreau told us. There's no right or wrong answer. The question is, do you feel ready to face Martine? After careful consideration, we decided to accept. Not immediately, but we set a date 3 months from now for our first visit. Those 3 months were a period of intense emotional preparation. We worked hard in therapy to strengthen our defenses and establish clear boundaries. The day of the visit finally arrived. Hand in hand, Francois and I walked through the prison gates. Seeing Martine, sitting behind a table in the visiting room, was a shock. She seemed to have aged 10 years, all trace of her former arrogance gone. Francois, Amélie, she said in a weak voice. I'm so sorry. The conversation that followed was difficult, full of conflicting emotions. But by the end of the visit, all three of us felt a sense of relief. It was only a beginning, but it was a step towards healing. As I left the prison that day, Francois shook my hand. Thank you for coming with me, he said. I couldn't have done it without you. I smiled, feeling a wave of love and gratitude wash over me. We're a team, remember? The months that followed continued to bring us challenges, but also joys. We learned to celebrate the small victories, to appreciate every moment of happiness. A year after this whole story began, Francois surprised me with a romantic weekend in the countryside. Sitting on the terrace of our hotel room, watching the sun set over the vineyards, he took my hand. Amélie, he said softly, I know this has been a difficult year. But I wanted to tell you how grateful I am to have you in my life. You've shown me what real love is, what real strength is. With tears in my eyes, I kissed him. We've been through this together, I whispered. And we're stronger for it. That evening, as I watched the stars appear in the sky, I realized how much we had grown. We had learned the importance of communication, honesty, and trust. We'd learned to set healthy boundaries, even with family. And above all, we'd learned that love, true love, can survive even the most violent storms. Our story was far from over. We would still have challenges to face, obstacles to overcome. But now we knew we could face anything, as long as we stayed united. As night fell over the vineyards, I squeezed Francois' hand, grateful for our journey, for our struggles, and for the love that had carried us through it all. We were ready for the next chapter of our lives, whatever it held in store for us.